Parents kicked me out for getting pregnant at 19. Years later, I returned with a shocking truth for them. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The smell of fresh rain mixed with the distant hum of the highway as Rachel steered her car down the familiar winding road leading to her childhood home. It had been over a decade since she last saw the large white colonial house looming in the distance. Her parents had built that home brick by brick, just as they'd built their family business, Kessler Industries, from the ground up. The company had been their pride, their identity, and the reason Rachel had been exiled. At 19, pregnant and defiant, Rachel had been kicked out by her parents, Richard and Evelyn Kessler. Her crime: falling in love with the wrong man and bringing shame to their pristine reputation. They had demanded she give up the child for adoption and return to the fold. When she refused, they severed ties, leaving her alone to fend for herself in a world that was far colder than she had imagined. But Rachel wasn't one to let life defeat her. She fought tooth and nail to raise her daughter, Emily, without any support. She worked odd jobs, scraped by on whatever she could, and eventually, through grit and sheer determination, built a career of her own. What had started as a small consulting gig had blossomed into something she never expected: a thriving business that rivaled Kessler Industries. Ironically, it was the very skills she learned growing up in that house that had propelled her forward, even when her family had tried to tear her down. Now, over 10 years later, Rachel was returning. Her parents didn't know it, but she had been watching their downfall from a distance. The cracks in Kessler Industries had begun to show a few years ago. Bad investments, poor management decisions, and a reluctance to adapt to changing markets had left the company on the verge of collapse. And while her parents had been too proud to admit it, they had no choice but to reach out to her, their estranged daughter, for help. Rachel parked her car in the driveway, staring at the house for a long moment before stepping out. The gravel crunched under her boots as she made her way to the front door. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her shoulders, memories of heated arguments, slammed doors, and accusations swirling in her mind. But she wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago. She was stronger, smarter, and this time she held all the cards. The door creaked open, revealing the stern face of Evelyn Kessler. Her mother's once vibrant red hair was streaked with gray, and the lines on her face had deepened since Rachel last saw her. There was a moment of silence as they stared at each other, neither willing to speak first. Then Evelyn stepped aside, allowing Rachel to enter. "You're late," Evelyn said, her tone clipped, as if the years of estrangement were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Rachel glanced around the foyer, noting how little had changed. The same expensive rugs, the same polished wood, the same coldness that had driven her away. She forced a smile. "It's good to see you too, Mother." Her father, Richard, appeared at the top of the stairs, his presence as commanding as ever, though the weight of his years was evident in the stiffness of his movements. He descended slowly, his eyes locked on Rachel, sizing her up like a business adversary rather than his daughter. "Rachel," he said gruffly, "I'm glad you could make it." "Didn't seem like I had much of a choice," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Richard gestured toward the study, a signal that the pleasantries were over. As they entered, Rachel took a seat across from her parents, her gaze wandering to the framed photos lining the walls. Pictures of Kessler Industries' early days, of her parents smiling in front of their first factory. But there were no pictures of her, no reminders of the life she had built away from them. "We've hit a rough patch," Richard began, cutting straight to the point. "Kessler Industries has faced some challenges, and we need your expertise to turn things around." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Funny how things change. You didn't want anything to do with me when I was 19, but now that you need me, here I am." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tapping on the armrest. "We're not here to rehash the past, Rachel. We made mistakes. But the business is your life," Rachel interrupted, her voice laced with bitterness. "It always has been." Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the conversation. "We don't have time for this. Kessler Industries is bleeding money. We've lost key investors, and if we don't find a way to stabilize things, we'll lose everything. Why should I help you? Rachel asked, crossing her arms. After everything you put me through. Her parents exchanged a glance, and for the first time, Rachel saw a flicker of vulnerability in her father's eyes. Richard Kessler was a proud man, but he was also desperate. We've already lost too much, he said quietly. You're our only chance. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Rachel could feel the shift in power. She had waited years for this moment, for the day her parents would come to her, not as their rebellious daughter, but as their equal, or better yet, their savior. I'll help you, Rachel said slowly, but on my terms. Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise, while Richard's jaw clenched in frustration. What do you mean, your terms? He asked. Rachel smiled, her confidence unwavering. I want a controlling interest in the company. 51% of Kessler Industries, or I walk. The silence that followed Rachel's declaration was thick, suffocating even. Her father's face twisted into a scowl, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. Richard Kessler wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by his daughter. Rachel kept her gaze locked on him, refusing to back down. She had come too far, endured too much to flinch now. 51%. Richard finally spat, his voice low but simmering with anger. Are you out of your mind? Rachel didn't blink. It's a fair deal. If I'm the one pulling your company out of the fire, then I'm not doing it for scraps. You're asking for my expertise, my time, my reputation. I want control. 51% or nothing. Her father's knuckles were white as he gripped the armrests of his chair, the tension in his posture a clear sign that he was battling between his pride and his desperation. Evelyn, who had been quiet until now, cleared her throat softly, her eyes flitting nervously between her husband and daughter. Rachel, Evelyn began, her tone conciliatory. Surely we can find a compromise. 51% is excessive. Perhaps a seat on the board, some decision-making power. Decision-making power doesn't keep me from getting overruled, Rachel cut in sharply. I'm not interested in being a figurehead or a pawn in this game. I'm offering to save your company, but I'm doing it on my terms. Richard rose from his seat, pacing the room like a caged animal. This is absurd, he muttered under his breath. We're not handing over the company we built to you on a silver platter. Rachel stood as well, her presence commanding even against her father's imposing figure. You're not handing me anything. I've earned this. And the truth is, you need me more than I need you. You can either take my offer, or you can watch Kessler Industries burn. The coldness in her voice sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. She had always known Rachel was strong, but this was different. This was a woman who had been forged in fire, who had faced the world alone and come out stronger. And now she was standing before them, offering salvation at a price. Richard stopped pacing, his back to them as he stared out the window. The minutes ticked by in silence, each one heavier than the last. Finally he turned around, his face tight with suppressed rage. But there was something else there too, defeat. 35%, he said, his voice strained. I'll give you 35% of the company and a seat on the board. You'll have a significant say in the direction of the company, but I won't hand over majority control. That's my final offer. Rachel shook her head, a bitter smile curling her lips. Still trying to hold on to the reins, huh? 35% might have been enough if you'd come to me a few years ago, but not now. The company is circling the drain, Dad. You don't have the leverage you think you do. She turned to leave, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way toward the door. For a brief moment, Richard didn't move, as if paralyzed by the weight of his own stubbornness. Then, just as her hand touched the doorknob, his voice broke through the tension. Wait. Rachel paused but didn't turn around. She could feel her father's pride crumbling, the years of arrogance and control falling away. When she finally turned back, his shoulders were slumped, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed. 51%, Richard said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You'll get your 51%. Rachel's heart raced, but she kept her face composed, knowing that this victory was only the beginning. She had the control she wanted, but now came the hard part: saving a company that had been rotting from the inside out. "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, legal documents, and tense negotiations. Rachel didn't waste any time. Once the deal was signed, she dove into the mess that was Kessler Industries, determined to figure out just how bad things had gotten. The more she dug, the worse it became. The company had been bleeding money for years, hemorrhaging from poor investments and outdated business models. Their technology division, once the crown jewel of Kessler Industries, had fallen behind competitors, while their real estate ventures were mired in debt. Richard and Evelyn had spent the last decade relying on their old-school business tactics, refusing to adapt to the modern marketplace, and now they were paying the price. Rachel worked day and night, often staying late in the office long after everyone else had gone home. She met with department heads, analyzed financial reports, and drafted new strategies to turn the company around. Her parents, though reluctant at first, gradually began to realize just how much they had underestimated their daughter. It wasn't long before the board of directors noticed the shift in power. Whispers of Rachel's rise to control spread like wildfire, and not all of them were pleased. Some of the old guard loyal to Richard viewed her as an outsider, a usurper who hadn't earned her place. But Rachel didn't care. She wasn't there to win popularity contests. She was there to save the company, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. One afternoon, as Rachel was reviewing a particularly troubling financial report, her phone buzzed. It was an email from her lawyer, the subject line catching her attention immediately. "Transfer of shares finalized." Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she opened the email and read the confirmation. It was done. She was now the majority shareholder of Kessler Industries. For the first time in her life, she held the power her parents had always lorded over her. But as she sat back in her chair, a thought gnawed at the back of her mind. There was something about the company's finances that didn't add up, something deeper than just bad investments. She had noticed odd transactions, large sums of money disappearing into shell companies, and contracts that didn't make sense. Someone had been siphoning off funds for years, hiding their tracks well enough that even her father hadn't noticed. Rachel's fingers flew across her keyboard as she began digging deeper into the company's financials. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just incompetence or poor management. This was deliberate embezzlement, and it had been going on for a long time. Her heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. She cross-referenced the transactions with employee records, pulling up names and addresses, searching for any connection. And then she found it. The shell companies were all tied to one person. Someone close to the family, someone they trusted. Her mother. Rachel stared at the computer screen, the damning evidence in front of her. The shell companies, the secret accounts, the trail of money. All of it led back to Evelyn Kessler. Her mother had been quietly siphoning off millions from Kessler Industries for years, hiding it in offshore accounts under false names. Rachel felt a surge of disbelief mixed with anger. How could her own mother, the woman who had so vehemently defended the family's honor and integrity, be responsible for this betrayal? She leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. This changed everything. Her mother had been complicit in the company's financial collapse, perhaps even orchestrating it to her own benefit. All this time, Rachel had assumed her parents' mistakes were the result of pride and poor decisions. But this was something far more sinister. Rachel knew she had to act carefully. The company was still hanging by a thread, and a scandal of this magnitude could destroy everything. But more than that, she needed to confront her mother, to understand why she had done this. Was it greed, revenge, or something else entirely? The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, as the sun set over the Kessler estate, Rachel found her mother alone in the study, nursing a glass of wine. Evelyn didn't look up as Rachel entered the room, too lost in her thoughts to notice her daughter's presence. Rachel closed the door behind her softly, the click of the latch finally drawing Evelyn's attention. "Rachel," Evelyn said, her voice cool and detached. "I didn't expect to see you here so late." "I need to talk to you," Rachel replied, her tone measured, though the weight of what she had discovered pressed heavily on her chest. "About the company." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, swirling the wine in her glass. "What about it? We've already agreed on the terms. You have your control now, don't you?" Rachel stepped closer, her eyes locked on her mother's. "This isn't about the deal. It's about the missing money." For a moment, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossed Evelyn's face, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Mother." Rachel's voice hardened. "I've seen the accounts, the shell companies, the money you've been embezzling from Kessler Industries for years." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Evelyn's grip on the wine glass tightened, her knuckles turning white. But she didn't deny it. She didn't even try to defend herself. Instead, she set the glass down on the table with a soft clink and turned to face Rachel fully. "And what are you going to do about it?" Evelyn's voice was low, almost daring. "Go to the authorities. Expose me. Bring down the family for good." Rachel stared at her mother, searching her face for any sign of remorse, but there was none, just cold, calculating indifference. "Why?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do it?" Evelyn let out a bitter laugh, standing up from her chair and walking to the window, looking out over the sprawling estate. "Do you have any idea what it's like to live in your father's shadow for decades? To be nothing more than an accessory to his success? I built this family, Rachel. I made sacrifices you can't even imagine. But in the end it was never enough. He always held the power and I was just there to keep up appearances." Her words were laced with resentment, years of pent-up bitterness spilling out as she spoke. "So yes," Evelyn continued, her back still to Rachel. "I took what I deserved, piece by piece, year by year. I earned it." Rachel felt a wave of disgust rise in her throat. "You destroyed the company for your own greed," she said, her voice shaking. "You put everything at risk. Our legacy, family. And for what? To prove a point." Evelyn turned around, her eyes glinting with anger. "Don't you dare lecture me about family. You were gone for years, Rachel. You left us behind. You think you're any better than me. You're here now because you want control just like I did. We're more alike than you think." Rachel shook her head, disbelief and fury bubbling to the surface. "I didn't come back for control. I came back because I thought I could help. But now I see the truth. You and Dad. You were never going to change." For the first time, Evelyn's confident facade cracked. Her eyes flickered with something that almost resembled regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "So what now?" Evelyn asked, crossing her arms. "Are you going to expose me? Bring down Kessler Industries? Destroy everything your father and I built?" Rachel hesitated, her mind racing. She could destroy her mother, drag her name through the mud, and watch the empire they had built together crumble. But then what? The company would collapse, and with it, the livelihoods of countless employees who depended on it. Her father would be ruined, and their family's name would be tainted forever. No, that wasn't the answer. Rachel straightened her shoulders, her decision made. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not going to expose you. Not yet." Evelyn blinked, clearly surprised. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to fix this," Rachel continued, her voice steady. "But you're going to step down. You'll resign quietly, and you'll disappear. No one will know the truth, but you'll be out of the picture for good. I'll clean up this mess, and Kessler Industries will survive. But you're done." Evelyn stared at her, the shock evident on her face. For a moment, she looked as though she might argue, but then she seemed to accept the inevitable. She knew Rachel had won. "And what about your father?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Are you going to tell him?" Rachel paused, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "No," she finally said. "I'll handle him too. But he'll never know the full extent of what you did." Evelyn's lips tightened into a thin line, but she nodded. "Fine," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll step down." Rachel exhaled, the tension in the room easing slightly. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. The truth was out, and the family business could still be saved. But at what cost? The price of betrayal was heavy, and it would haunt her for years to come. As Evelyn left the room, Rachel stood alone, staring at the empty wine glass on the table. She had come back to her family with the hope of healing old wounds, of proving her worth. But now she saw that the past could never be erased, only buried. The next day, the resignation of Evelyn Kessler was quietly announced to the board. Rachel took full control of Kessler Industries, positioning herself not just as a savior, but as the rightful leader of the company. The business began to recover under her guidance, new deals were struck, and slowly, the wounds began to heal, at least on the surface. But deep down, Rachel knew the truth would always linger in the shadows, a silent reminder of the cost of power, control, and family secrets. And though the Kessler name would survive, it would forever be built on the fragile foundation of lies and betrayal. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.